Thank you all for showing. I hope you all had a really good time at the party last night, and I'm happy to see you all here so bright and early this morning. My name is Jen Lampton, and I've been a member of the Drupal open source community since about 2006. I'm a developer, a trainer, and a longtime Drupal evangelist. Today, I'm going to share with you some problems the Drupal community has been facing, and also some potential solutions that I think that Symfony might try to prevent these kind of problems from happening in your own community. How many of you here have experience with Drupal? All right, so for the rest of you, you might not know that I was an initiative lead for Drupal 8. I was, for about 2 years, the leader behind the movement to try and get Twig into Drupal core. I'm coming to some of these problems with an experience of an insider of what it feels like to be part of trying to create software in this really big community. I also know a little bit something about the community behind Drupal. I've been an organizer for the largest free Drupal event in the world since about 2007, and that's Badcamp. And I was also on the committee to run DrupalCon San Francisco back in 2010, and that was the first DrupalCon that had more than 3,000 people in attendance. But today, I stand in front of you, one of the founders of Backdrop CMS, which is a fork of the Drupal project. There are a lot of reasons that open source projects get forked. But ours is quite simple. We discovered that our values were not the same as the ones that were most important to those in the Drupal community. Symfony is now 10 years old. You've already experienced growth and handled it gracefully, but I'd be willing to bet that you're about to get an influx of new members in your community. You'll be welcoming members of the Drupal community, and I hope it will be useful to you to know what we've already experienced. The Drupal community is really large. It's an amazing group of bright, talented, passionate individuals, and there are a lot of people involved. Drupal itself is 13 years old, almost 14, and we've had almost 2,500 people who've worked on Drupal 8. We've had 9,715 contributed modules for Drupal 7, so this is the current stable version of Drupal. And these two numbers give you a really good idea for how many developers are in the Drupal community. But unlike Symfony, the Drupal community is made up of a lot of people who aren't necessarily developers. We have project managers, designers, content strategists, and of course, a ton of business people. But our community is also made up of a bunch of people that don't have anything to do with the business of Drupal. We have people who are in it for fun, and people who are in it for love. There are 1.5 million registered accounts on Drupal.org. For the most part, growth is a good thing. For starters, it validates that the product that you're creating is something that solves a need for a bunch of other people. So you've got to be doing something right. It tends to future-proof. So if you have a bunch of people who are all working together on the same thing, it's going to be less likely that that project will ever be abandoned. We've got increased resources. So there's a ton of developers who are all solving problems, and it could be that the problems that you're solving for your clients are also getting solved by some other developer somewhere else, so you can collaborate on work, you'll have less work to do personally, more problems get solved. That's generally a really good thing. Better job opportunities. If you love what you're doing but hate who you're doing it for, that's fine. You can go do it for someone else. There's plenty of need out there. And the best part about having a growing community means that more people are being helped by the product that you're working on. But there are a bunch of other things that are also growing as your community is growing, and those tend to be problems. I'm going to go over a couple of problems that Drupal community has run into and give you some specific examples, and then I'm going to talk about some solutions. For starters, the Drupal community has a really hard time controlling scope. I find this something that's really important in my client work. Like you sit down at the beginning of the project and you try and figure out exactly what it is you're building, and that helps you determine how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. In the Drupal community, we don't do this at all. A lot of times when we try and figure out, okay, well, this feature needs to be pushed to the next release, that happens when it's too late to put it into the current release. And if you ever have a feature and you wonder, like, when does this feature request get denied? That answer is never. Every single time someone has a feature request, the answer is, if you have the ability to work on this, you can get it in. The Drupal community also tends to have a problem with understanding the size of the product it's building. We often have two different competing angles. There are a whole bunch of people who want to have what's called a small core. They try and remove a bunch of modules that aren't used on every site. They're trying to create something that only exists of everything you actually need to build a site. And at the same time, we have a group of people who are trying to build a complete product with Drupal. So you don't need to add any modules. You just install it and you can do anything you want. And even in the Drupal 8 lifecycle, we had all these competing forces at work. We had some people going and pulling out things that weren't necessary and adding modules that we thought every website needed, like views. And then we have other people who are adding in the complete sweat of modules, the things that you think will sell the product, or the things that you think will make it attractive for some people, but not everyone. Another problem we have in the Drupal community is keeping focus. And this is often driven by the fact that we don't control our scope very well. But we have more than 14,000 open issues for Drupal core alone. When you have that many open issues, it's really hard to choose what to work on. Sometimes you don't know where to begin. Like if you're new and you want to contribute and you're like, oh, let me just jump in an issue, and you see this list of 14,000 issues, you're like, which one do I start with? And even if you're an experienced contributor, sometimes it's really hard for you to know what's most important. Like we don't have an outline scope of what's going to be in the next release. What do I work on and when? If you compare that number to the number of currently open issues for Symfony, there's only 654. I feel like that's a really reasonable number. I could read all of those in a weekend. There's no way you could do that with Drupal. Another problem we have in the Drupal community are roadblocks. And this is something that I face on a regular basis with my clients, where I'll have a client, they'll run into a bug in core, I'll fix it, I'll post a fix, and then I leave. And I come back a little while later, and it turns out that, oh, well, my fix wasn't good enough for core because there's a bunch of problems that I'm not facing that haven't been solved by my solution. So this is not a fix that's going into core. Instead, I need to add Postgres support. Well, I don't use Postgres. I can't even write Postgres support. I don't even know how to set up a Postgres database. But that solution isn't going to get in until that happens. So you've hit a roadblock in terms of solving problems. We also have a problem in Drupal with an increasing learning curve. And this is something that you've noticed with every version of Drupal. The learning curve for new people to get into it gets higher and higher. In Drupal 6, we added a new theme system and a new menu system. In Drupal 7, we added a database abstraction layer. We changed the theme system. We changed all the way the hooks worked. And then Drupal 8, we're also adding things like annotations, which come from Doctrine. We're adding dependency injections, which come from Symfony. And we're adding plugins, which is a Drupal wrapper around both of them, in addition to doing things like changing the theme layer again, changing the modules or the menu system again. So with every change, there becomes a whole bunch more you need to learn. In terms of using Drupal, you've got to learn how to install it, set it up, design it or theme it, add features or modules, write your own modules perhaps, support it over the long term, upgrade it, and then you've got to learn how to contribute, which is also another point in the learning curve. With that increasing learning curve, it's not hard to understand how we end up not getting as many new people as we maybe used to have. And part of this is because there aren't that many people thinking about the first-time experience. This is something that Fabian mentioned yesterday in his keynote. And I think it's really hard for people who are experts to kind of put on their hat as to what was this like when I was new, or what would this be like today if I was someone new approaching this project. And how easy is it for those people to get help? Right? As an experienced expert, you don't need help, you just trudge right through it. But if you're new, where do you go? Who do you turn to? How do you ask? And what else might be preventing these new people from adopting? And I think a lot of times we don't spend enough time thinking about that first-time experience. Another problem we have in Drupal is with the quality of our documentation. Sometimes it's really hard to find documentation on exactly what you're looking for. Sometimes you find it, but it's not accurate anymore. Sometimes it's not complete. It'll tell you to do half of the thing that you needed to know how to do. Sometimes there's way too little. It's not enough information. And as is more often the common with Drupal, sometimes there's way too much documentation. How do you keep that documentation up to date? We've got 13 years of docs about how to do something specific. Who's going to maintain that? Who's responsible for taking care of all of that documentation? We also have a problem with backwards compatibility in Drupal. And for a long time, we've had a policy towards not having backwards compatibility, but because our changes were coming out annually, we didn't have enough time to change anything too much. So you'd go from Drupal 4.7 to Drupal 5, and you change a little. You go from 5 to 6, and you change a little more. But there's just not that much time to make that much of a difference. But lately, we aren't having regular releases anymore, and so we end up changing everything from version to version. What this means is that for our end users, it ends up, instead of being an upgrade, it's being a rebuild, and it costs an entirely new reinvestment into perhaps building the same site you had when you started with. I know the Symfony community has its own well-documented policies about backwards compatibility, which I think is great. I think that's going to be super useful for the Drupal community to see how you guys handle that and perhaps take some of those ideas back to its own community. Drupal also has a problem with increasing complexity. And a lot of this is because we're using Drupal to solve really hard problems, and sometimes really hard problems need really complex solutions. But sometimes we also use really complex solutions for problems that aren't that hard. This is one of my favorite quotes. It talks about how you can solve any problem by adding another layer of abstraction, except for the problem of having too many layers of abstraction, which I think is something that I run into very often when working with Drupal. Having all of these things going on at the same time, of course, leads to frustration for our developers. And sometimes that comes from the inability to get anything done. Like you put in a lot of time, you work on this patch, you learn how to write queries for Postgres, and you finally get it going and you still can't get it in. That can be a frustrating experience for new contributors as well as longtime ones. And sometimes you get really frustrated by not being able to get your perspective heard or understood. So if you're in an issue queue and you're trying to say, no, it shouldn't be this way because of X, and no one really understands your X, and no one can really relate to the problems you're having, that can also be a really frustrating experience for you. And sometimes people just don't feel appreciated. There are so many developers in the Drupal community, and everyone's doing so much, that sometimes there just isn't anyone to say, you know, thank you. We know your patch didn't get in, but we appreciate that work that you're doing. And these kind of problems can lead to burnout. And we've had a lot of really great core developers lately rage quit or walk away from the project because they feel like they've poured too much of their heart into it and they aren't getting appreciated. They're getting too much frustration. They're working too hard and they're getting too little accomplished. So having people leave your community is a bad thing, especially if it's because of your tools or your process, or the way your community manages things. Another problem we sometimes have in the Drupal community is with our leadership. Trying to figure out who's in charge for specific things can sometimes be really hard. It's not necessarily a clearly documented structure of who's in charge of what. And trying to make sure that people from the outside can see how it works. I feel like being on the inside of the Drupal community, I know who's in charge of which initiative. I know who to go to if I have problems with certain things. But from the outside, nobody knows that. Nobody knows that there's a documentation team with a certain lead or a translation team and a certain lead. It's all just kind of invisible from the outside. And I think it would be really useful if you have someone who's passionate about working on translation to get them in touch with the people working on translation and making it really clear for them to figure out who those people are. And another thing that's really important is to make sure that people who are in leadership positions are empowered to create change. Like, can you make commits based on what you're working on? Or can you run events or do the things that you need to do in order for your jobs to be successful? Another thing we often have problems with in Drupal is making decisions. Usually the way this is handled is in an issue queue, and if you have two people getting an argument, you end up with the same two comments back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for 300 comments. At the bottom, you're like, this is not a good way to make a decision. Sometimes you need to step back and evaluate, like, what trade-offs should we be making? Like, each one of these has pros and cons. What is our project trying to achieve, and which one should we choose based on that? A consensus isn't going to scale. You can't get everyone in a huge issue with a bunch of different stakeholders on the same page. It's just not going to happen. So you need to be able to understand when you can make a trade-off and how. And using this issue queue consensus pattern, what usually happens is that the loudest voice wins. And that means that the person with who's most passionate, or the person with the most time, or the person who has the most influence usually ends up making the statement enough times that they end up convincing people that that's what should happen. But maybe that's not what's best for the entire project. That's not what's best for everyone in the community. That's just the way the issue happened to end. And another thing is, if you're going to ask the community what decision should be reached, you need to understand who's actually answering that question. In the world of web, there's this concept of the 1% rule. So if you take a blog, for example, you can generally assume that 1% of people are going to be creating blog posts on this blog site. And you might have 9% of people who are adding comments and responding to that blog, and those are your active members of your community. But there's 90% of people who are reading and absorbing that information without giving you any feedback at all. And this same model also carries over to open source. And we crunched the numbers on the Drupal community earlier this year, and it's actually like a 0.02% rule when it comes to Drupal, where you have 0.02% of people who are your core developers. Those are the ones who are writing the APIs. And then you have 1.98% people, those are people who are using the APIs. They're posting comments, they're filing issues, they're interacting in a way that you can see it. But 98% of our community is completely silent. These are people who use Drupal every day, but have never posted an issue, have never created a module, have never interacted with the community in a meaningful way. So how do you know, if you're asking 2% of your community, what the answer should be, if that answer is the right answer for 100% of your community? And another thing that that leads into, of course, is money. Money, people often think is a really good thing to have in your community, but money often creates invisible influence, where when you have a situation where the most passionate voice wins, that can also be the person who is funded to get that feature in. They can then get in the issue queue and say, we really need it because X, Y, and Z, and they're paid every day to go into that issue queue and make sure that it gets in, and guess what, it's gonna get in. And whether you think about it or not, that means that money is gonna be steering the direction of your project. So the companies that can hire developers to get their problem solved are gonna get their problem solved first. Another problem that's really important to consider in your community is if your tools are going to scale appropriately. And this is something we run into Drupal a lot because we started doing things one way when Drupal was small, and now here we are years later when Drupal's big, and it's really hard to change. Like, change is hard for anyone. Change is really, really hard on a really big scale. Our issue queues have more than 10,000 issues. How do you find issues? How do you post issues? How do you manage issues if you're in charge of an initiative when you have that many to deal with? We used to communicate in IRC. Originally, we had one channel. When you get more than 500 people in that channel, how do you have a meaningful conversation? We used to have mailing lists. When you get thousands of people on a mailing list, does it just become noise, or can you still get value out of that mailing list? For a really long time, we were using CVS as our version control system. It might not be a great way to deal with it when you have thousands of people trying to contribute. And how do you keep the feel of your conferences intimate when you have thousands of people present? So those are some problems. I have some ideas for some potential solutions for some of these. I'm not entirely sure they're gonna work because they haven't been tried and tested, but I do wanna run them by you and see what you guys think. First and foremost, I think this is something that's super important for a community, is to write a good mission statement. Some way that you can convey to people the essence of your project, its goals, and if possible, its audience is really important. So just for fun, I compared several PHP open source projects and their mission statements to see what was going on. So let's take a look at Symfony. I found this on the Symfony page that says its mission statement is that Symfony is entirely free and published under the MIT license. How many people think that's a great mission statement? Right. Well, I actually don't think this is your mission statement. I mean, it's under that heading, but I don't think that's actually what it is. I found another statement that's under your philosophy that I think is a lot closer to a mission statement. This is embracing and promoting professionalism, best practices, standardization, and interoperability of applications. And that to me reads a lot like a mission statement. It has a lot of value. It's pretty good. For comparison, if you look at Drupal's mission statement, there's a lot of words in it. Basically what it says is Drupal's mission is to create a CMS. That doesn't really provide a lot of value in terms of what kind of CMS, who is it for, what do you stand for. It's just kind of like, we're gonna make a CMS. If you want to see a really great example of a mission statement, I would encourage you to check WordPress. WordPress has done a lot of thought about who their community is, what their product is, and specifically what it's for. And they've done this great job of creating a mission statement. It says, to democratize publishing through open source GPL software. So that's exactly what they're doing. They're creating an awesome blog. Their mission statement says their goal is to create an awesome blog. Next thing that's super important is to identify your audience. And this is something that I have a personal stake in. So who is this software for? So if we take a look at Symfony's mission statement, I can get from this that it's for professionals, and there's a lot of words in here that make me think that that's professional developers, but that isn't exactly what I was looking for in terms of finding a target audience. If we look at our good example of WordPress, on their philosophy page, they specifically say that WordPress is intended for the non-technically minded, and they will always come first in making decisions about where their software is going. I would love to see something like that written for Symfony as well. If you compare that to Drupal, you can't find anything anywhere about who Drupal is for. And there's a specific reason for this. Drupal has always said that it is everything to everyone. And for a really long time, it was able to do that. It was able to create a great CMS that worked for everyone. But we're starting to run into these problems now where, since we've never claimed an audience for Drupal, everyone can choose to believe that it's something different. So some mom and pop shop that uses Drupal says, oh, it's great for these small sites that I do. Education says, oh, it's meant for education. And the enterprise is like, no, 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 it's an enterprise CMS. Who's right? And when you know who your audience is, it's easier for you to make decisions about the direction the software should go in. If you don't say anything, then you get back to that problem of the loudest voice always winning. Another thing that's super important is to define the philosophy. These are the most important things to your community, your principles. If you can outline them, like, what does it mean to be Symfony? What do we stand for? If this exists for this community, I couldn't find it. The closest thing I found to that philosophy was your mission statement. I think it'd be really great, I know these probably exist somewhere, it'd be great to publish them, post them on the internet, so if people come to your community will understand, like, what do we stand for? If you look at Drupal, they have a set of principles posted, and I actually think that this is worse than not having it posted, because this page is years out of date, and it's actually wrong in a couple of cases. And I think that is the kind of thing where if you read their principles, you would totally get on board with you. Say, yes, I agree with all of those things. But in practice, when you're in the issue queues and you're seeing decisions being made, and you compare the decisions to the principles that are listed, they don't match anymore. And I think that's because Drupal has advanced beyond what this page says, and it would be good to get some accurate statements of what we actually stand for in the Drupal community. Again, our good example, WordPress has a really lengthy description of what its principles are, what it stands for, how it should be used. And if you want to see a great example of principles, I would recommend reading the WordPress page. Another thing that's super important for growing open source communities is to establish a clear leadership structure. And there's many communities that use the same general structure, which is to have a BDFL, or a benevolent dictator for life. And I think that this is a perfectly fine model, but it's really important to keep in mind that a BDFL does not scale. You cannot have one person managing thousands of people without some kind of good support structure underneath them. So there's definitely ways that you can create that support structure for your BDFL, and you've got to think about different ways that you can do that so that your project can scale beneath them. You can have multiple core committers. This is something the Drupal project's done with a lot of success. You can have core development teams. I think this is something Symfony project's doing. It's something WordPress projects is doing. A bunch of people who are in charge of specific things or specific releases. You can have initiatives and initiative leads. That's something else the Drupal project's doing to try and delegate authority. Or you can have working groups, so people who work together on solving certain problems. What would be really important is if these support structures are also clearly defined. This is another gray area in Drupal where no one can really see it. It's a gray area in a lot of communities that I think needs clarification. So people coming in can say, where do I fit into this structure? How do I get involved? Who do I talk to? And another thing that I think is most important is to make sure that if you do establish a leadership structure, those leaders need to be empowered. They need to be able to actually do things. And I feel like in Drupal especially, it's like, oh, you guys want to do something? Go over there and talk about it. But that's all you really get to do is talk about it. You aren't empowered to make those changes yourself. There's another model you can use to create structure for your leadership. And I think both Symfony and WordPress have companies behind them, and a lot of the planning that happens goes on in these companies. And in both of these cases, it's a little bit invisible to the outside world how these decisions are reached. I think that's fine. It's good to have companies that are driving these products. It makes really strong products. But it would also be good if you could kind of inform the community what exactly is going on. And then there's another way to deal with leadership too that doesn't involve a benevolent dictator for life. There's a model that Apache has adopted called the Project Management Committee. And this is the model that we've decided to use for Backdrop as well, where you establish a group of people who will be voting and making decisions for the direction of the project. And that scales a little bit better because it's not just one person. You can have a ton of people. You can also create a bunch of different committees if you need to. Another thing that's super important is figuring out how to make decisions. If you have a BDFL, one of the things you might say is, well, that person is just going to get the last say in everything. And I think that that's fine. That's a perfectly fine way to do it as long as they're willing to make that decision, and that's documented somewhere. So if you have some decision that needs to be made and someone says this is the way it is, you aren't going to get a bunch of people from the community arguing about it because they know that that's the last say. You could also have your project management committee vote and say, this is the final say, it has been determined. You could also say, maybe the vote isn't just the PMC, but it's the community and you need to get a majority. You could also try and do it with consensus. I don't recommend that, it doesn't work. And then of course, if you are gonna ask the community, again, remember who's answering. Those same things are true for conflict resolution. You need to have someone have the last say. So this isn't necessarily all decisions, but if you have two people, for example, in an issue queue who are both trusted members of community and they're taking opposite sides on an issue, how do you decide which way you're gonna go? And it's good to be able to say, well, we'll bring in the BDFL to make a decision on this, or we'll bring in the PMC, this issue will get escalated and they'll come to a decision. You can also attempt mediation, right? You can either have your BDFL mediate, or you can send in a recommended mediator, try and figure out what both sides are, get them to come together, at least get some concessions. But it would really be important when you have conflicts to post the process for how these get resolved publicly, because if it looks arbitrary in every case, then people end up fighting harder, because they're like, oh, well, if you just fight harder, you can get your way, and that doesn't create a healthy community. Another thing that's super important is to make sure that all of your tools are updated. GitHub is an amazing tool, but it is not adequate for a giant open source community. Using Travis CI is really great, but there are ways that you can automate processes that make it even better. So take a look at how your community works, find inefficiencies, add tools to help you facilitate the ability to host your project on GitHub. Drupal.org has made a bunch of really great improvements to their issue queue. For us personally, moving from Drupal.org to GitHub was a really painful process because we don't have all of the awesome features that exist on Drupal.org for their issue queue. But it would be great if you can build a system on top of GitHub or a system that interacts with GitHub to get you those same kind of features. But knowing the limitations of your system and giving you the ability to adapt is also super useful. If you use IRC to communicate, create more channels when you get too many people in them. This is what happened in Drupal. We started with one pound Drupal channel. When there were too many people, then the core developers moved into Drupal contribute. Subgroups like mine moved into the channel Drupal twig. And there's lots of ways where you can get a more reasonable number of people in a channel where you can have a more meaningful conversation. Choose your mailing software quite wisely. There's been a lot of improvements to mailing list software. Getting one that aggregates and lists things for you so you can consult it online instead of in your inbox could be really useful. Creating more lists if you get too many people on your list is also a good way to do it. But keeping an eye on the tools that you're using and making sure that they remain manageable is super important. And in terms of your conferences, there's definitely ways that you can scale up to have a giant conference with 3,000 people, but you should also be looking for ways to scale down, to keep the intimacy and the feel together. So you can have local groups where it's like, oh, this is for Symfony Madrid, and that's different from Symfony Europe. Or you can have ones that are focused on specific aspects of the project. So one thing I like to mention is that all of the problems I've covered and most of the solutions are actually super interrelated. And just for fun, I drew a crazy little flow chart to try and figure out which things were related to which other things. And it turned out everything was all completely interrelated. And I looked at it and said, okay, well, if we just fixed one thing, if we just figured out what is our decision-making process in Drupal, how many other things would that fix? And it looks like, well, we'd know which direction the project was going in because we could decide. We'd know which size of a project we're going in. We'd know our scope. We'd know our focus. We'd decrease frustration and hopefully mitigate some burnout. And that seemed like, man, if I could solve one problem, our community would be so much better off. So I'm not sure any of the things I've talked about are going to solve any of these problems entirely, but I think it's important for communities to think about how these problems should be solved and come up with plans before they get to a point where the community is so large it's hard to change. Drupal was drawn to Symfony because of its architectural innovation. Symfony can in turn learn from the Drupal community, both in its successes and failures, to build a community that's not only large and growing, but is also inclusive, happy, and productive. Thanks.